Her wrist was already in motion when the door opened behind her. Sujin's palm cut through the air towards Simone's face and stopped mid-arc, caught by a hand that hadn't been in the room a second earlier. Fast enough that nobody had time to process what they were watching before it was already over. Nobody had heard the front door. Nobody had heard tires on gravel. And there he was, Junho, coat still on, one hand locked around his mother's wrist an inch from his wife's face. For a few seconds, the room forgot how to move. Jaiwoo's teacup stopped halfway to her mouth. The housekeeper near the kitchen doorway found something urgent to study on the floor. Sujin, a woman who had never once in her adult life been interrupted mid-motion inside her own house, stared at her son's hand like it belonged to someone she didn't recognize. "Early," she said. "Not why are you home? Not what did you just see? Just you're early." As though the only thing wrong tonight was his timing. He didn't answer. He was looking past her at his wife. Simone hadn't moved. Chin level, shoulders square, the stillness of a woman who decided weeks ago this family would never get to watch her come apart. But he saw the thing nobody else in the room had bothered to look for, her hand pressed flat against the table, not resting, holding. Like the wood was the only thing keeping her upright. 3 weeks, maybe longer. "Everyone out," he said. Quiet. Worse than shouting would have been. Nobody argued. Jaiwoo was gone before the second word left his mouth. The housekeeper followed without needing to be told twice. Only Sujin lingered, rubbing her wrist, searching her son's face for the boy who used to apologize first in every argument they'd ever had. She didn't find him. "Junho?" "Later," he said, and the word closed like a door. 3 weeks earlier, this house had sounded like an entirely different place. Simone remembered standing by the front door, arms crossed, watching his car clear the gate until the hedges swallowed it. He'd kissed her goodbye the way he always did, quick, certain, one hand at the small of her back a half-second longer than it needed to be. 3 days, he'd said. 4 at most. She had no reason to doubt him. She never had. What she hadn't planned for was how fast the air in that house would change once his car was gone. Sujin appeared in the sitting room doorway within 10 minutes, already rearranging the flowers Simone had cut that morning, already mentioning lightly, almost sweetly, that white lilies weren't really the custom in this family's home. Small things first. That was always how it started. A seat at dinner drifting, night by night, farther from the head of the table. Staff who used to greet her by name suddenly finding reasons to look elsewhere. Compliments from Jaiwoo arriving with something sharpened folded inside them. "You wear color so boldly." I could never. What none of them knew, what none of them had ever bothered to ask, was what Simone had built before she ever set foot in this house. 3 years running a logistics company out of her father's old warehouse after he died, sitting across desks from men twice her age who assumed a young black woman couldn't read a bill of lading, let alone on the company that issued it. She'd learned exactly what it looked like when someone underestimated her on purpose. She'd built a career proving them catastrophically wrong. She just hadn't expected to find that same look waiting for her inside her own marriage. What made the isolation harder, what she didn't say out loud to anyone, not even to herself in the mirror some mornings, was how much she missed him already. Not the version of him the world saw. The other one. The one who noticed things nobody asked him to notice. She thought about their first real conversation more than she meant to that week. Not the polished version people repeated at company dinners. The shipping contract that had accidentally overlapped. The 20-minute meeting that stretched into 2 hours. What she actually remembered was smaller than that. He'd learned she took her coffee black with exactly 1 ice cube, not by asking, but by watching her order it twice, 3 weeks apart, and getting it right the second time before she said a word. "That's not a coincidence," she'd told him. "That's a habit you built on purpose. Maybe I just pay attention," he'd said, and hadn't elaborated, and she remembered thinking dangerously, foolishly, that she wanted to know what else he paid attention to. She wanted that version of him back in this house. Instead, she had his absence, his mother's smile with new edges on it, and a growing unease she couldn't yet name. On the 4th night, unable to settle, she wandered into the east wing, the one part of the house she'd been quietly steered away from since the wedding, looking for a book she thought she'd left there. What she found instead was a half-open drawer in Sujin's study, and inside it, a ledger that matched none of the figures the company's accountants had ever shown Junho. She didn't touch it. She photographed 3 pages with hands that barely held still and closed the drawer exactly the way she'd found it. She didn't understand yet what she was looking at, but she understood the feeling of it, The particular cold that settles in when the woman insulting your table manners might also be doing something far more dangerous behind a locked door. She said nothing. Not even to Desmond when he called the next morning the way he always did. "You sound off," he said. "I'm fine." "Simone." "I said I'm fine, Des." He didn't buy it. She heard that in the pause before he let it drop, but he let it drop anyway because that had always been their arrangement. She told him things on her own time, not his. What she didn't tell him was that she'd already decided something. If this family wanted to treat her silence as weakness, she would let them believe it. Every slight, every small cruelty filed away like evidence. In a way, that's exactly what it was becoming. Before we go any further, if you're new here, welcome. We're glad you found this one. And if you've been with us a while already, welcome back. Good to have you again. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from tonight. We love seeing how far these stories travel. And if Simone already has you on her side, go ahead and like and subscribe, because what's coming is about to test her harder than a dinner table ever could. Sujin had not always been the woman who rearranged another woman's flowers out of spite. 30 years earlier, she had been the daughter of a syndicate that no longer existed, swallowed whole by a merger her own father had called a partnership and everyone else had called a surrender. She had married into the Kang name not for love, though love had come eventually, in its own complicated shape, but because her father's dying instruction had been simple: survive and take us with you. She had spent 3 decades making herself indispensable to a family that never fully considered her one of their own. She had buried a husband. She had raised 2 children inside a business that ate its week without ceremony. And somewhere in the last several years, quietly, without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened, she had started running out of ways to matter. The rival syndicate hadn't approached her with threats. That would have been easier to resist. They had approached her with an offer that sounded, at first, like restitution, a controlling stake in a shipping route that had once belonged to her father's family, returned to her, decades late, if she was willing to quietly redirect a portion of the Kang family's contracts their way. Not betrayal, she'd told herself. Correction. A closing of an old wound, 30 years overdue. She hadn't counted on how far it would go, or how fast the debt would compound once she'd let the first payment through. She hadn't counted on her son marrying a woman sharp enough to find the drawer she thought was locked. None of this excused what her hand had almost done in that sitting room. But it explained, at least to her, why she'd spent 3 weeks needing Simone to seem smaller than she was. A woman that observant was dangerous to a secret that size. And dangerous, too, to the version of herself Sujin had built her whole identity around. The matriarch who held this family together, not the one who'd quietly started selling pieces of it away. Choi Di-hyun noticed things, too. It was, after all, his job. He'd worked under Junho for 11 years, long enough to know the difference between the boss's controlled anger and the kind that meant somebody wasn't walking away from a conversation. He'd also worked in this house long enough to notice things the family preferred he didn't, like the courier who'd started arriving at odd hours during Junho's absence, always asking for Sujin directly. Never leaving a name, he'd said nothing. That was also his job, in a way the unspoken kind, the kind nobody wrote into a contract. Loyalty to the family meant loyalty to its silences as much as its secrets. But watching Simone move through that house those 3 weeks, steady, unbothered on the surface, sharper underneath than anyone gave her credit for, had started to needle at something in him he didn't have a comfortable name for. She reminded him, in a way he didn't examine too closely, of the version of loyalty he used to believe in before he'd learned how many kinds of it existed inside one family. The night the courier came for the 4th time, Di-hyun stood in the hallway outside Sujin's study long enough to hear 2 words through the door that didn't belong in a shipping company's business. He didn't go in. He didn't confront her. He went back to his room and sat with it until morning, turning over a version of loyalty that was starting to feel less like protection and more like complicity. He didn't call Junho either. Not yet. He told himself it was because he didn't have enough. The truth, closer to the surface than he wanted, was that he was afraid of what calling would cost. The mother of the man he'd sworn his life to protecting, exposed by his own hand, over a call that might not even reach him in time to matter. He decided in the end to wait, to watch, to see whether Simone found what he suspected she was already looking for. He didn't yet know how close he'd come to being right. The call came on the 5th night, later than he usually rang. "Quiet," Junho said, and she could hear something behind his voice, engines, distant conversation in a language she didn't fully catch, the specific stillness of a place that wasn't safe enough for this call to be happening at all. "I'm tired." "That's not what quiet sounds like on you." She almost told him everything right there. She got as far as opening her mouth. Then she heard voices behind him sharpen, heard him say something low and fast to someone else, heard the particular quiet of a man choosing his next words with a gun somewhere nearby that he wasn't mentioning to her. "I have to go," he said. "Simone, I know. Call when I can." "I know that too." Pause before he hung up ran half a second longer than nothing, and she spent longer than she wanted to admit wondering what lived inside it. She didn't tell him about the drawer. Not because she didn't trust him, because she'd heard exactly how thin the ice already was under his feet on the other end of that call, and she wasn't going to be the reason it cracked before she had proof solid enough to matter. She sat with the phone in her lap a long time after the line went dead, turning it over, thinking about the particular ache of loving someone whose job made honesty a liability instead of a comfort. She'd known what she was marrying into. She hadn't known it would feel like this, like holding her breath in a house full of people waiting for her to run out of air. By the second week, the cruelty had stopped hiding. Sujin began inviting guests without telling Simone at all, extended relatives, old family friends, women who looked at her the way you look at something spilled on a tablecloth nobody's gotten around to wiping up. Among them, more than once, was a woman named Yoon Hee-rin, poised, fluent in 3 languages, the daughter of a business ally Sujin had once hoped Junho would marry instead. Hee-rin was never cruel outright. She was worse than cruel. She was familiar. She touched Junho's name like she still had a claim to it, told stories about the old days with him that Simone had no way to verify or dispute, and watched Simone's face carefully every time she did it like she was checking for cracks. "He used to hate large parties," Hee-rin said one night, swirling wine she hadn't touched. "I'm surprised he tolerates them now." "Doesn't tolerate them," Simone said. "He leaves early and calls it strategy." A small ripple of laughter went around the table before anyone decided whether it was allowed. Hee-rin's smile thinned by exactly 1 degree. Sujin's eyes moved to Simone with something that looked almost like reassessment. Simone excused herself not long after, and if anyone noticed she hadn't touched her food, no one mentioned it. Later, alone in the guest wing she'd started sleeping in more nights than not, she opened her laptop and looked again at the photographs from that drawer. Numbers that didn't reconcile. A name she didn't recognize appearing 3 separate times, routed through an account that had no business existing. Her phone buzzed. Not a call, a photo. From him. A skyline she didn't recognize, too much rain, not enough light, and underneath it, "Thinking about your coffee order." She stared at it longer than the message deserved. It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't close to one. But it was proof he was still paying attention to small things 3 time zones away, in the middle of whatever he was actually doing over there, and it did something to her chest she didn't have time to examine. Black. "1 ice cube," she typed back. "Some things don't change. Some things shouldn't," he sent, almost immediately, like he'd been waiting. She read it 4 times before she put the phone down. Then she picked it back up and read it a 5th. There was a particular kind of danger in a man like Junho choosing his words, carefully even in something as small as a text message. Every syllable weighed, nothing wasted. And she was starting to understand that the same discipline that made him formidable in a boardroom or a negotiation with armed men was the exact thing that made his tenderness, on the rare occasions he let it show, feel like it had been earned rather than given away cheap. She fell asleep with the phone still in her hand. Hee-rin returned 3 days later, this time without the excuse of a dinner party. She simply appeared, invited by Sujin for tea, settling into the sitting room like she'd never left it. "You must get lonely," Hee-rin said, stirring a cup she wouldn't drink. "This house was built for a certain kind of wife, someone who grew up understanding its rhythms." "I'm learning the rhythms fine," Simone said. "Some of them are just louder than others." "I only mean Junho and I grew up in rooms like this one. There's a language to it, things people don't have to explain to each other." Hee-rin's eyes flicked, deliberate, toward Simone's hands. "I imagine it must be exhausting, always translating." Simone set her own cup down without a sound. "The only thing exhausting me right now is this conversation." She left the room before Hee-rin could recover a response, and if her heart was beating harder than the moment warranted, she told herself it was anger, not the small, ugly seed of doubt Hirin had planted on purpose. A language to it, things people don't have to explain to each other. She hated that the sentence found the one place in her that was still, after 2 years of marriage, a little unsure of its footing. She thought about calling him again that night. She didn't. Instead, she opened their message thread and read the coffee text over again, twice, until the doubt quieted enough to sleep. Desmond landed 2 days later unannounced, the way he always did when something in his gut told him to stop asking questions and just show up. He took one look at her across the arrivals hall, the careful makeup, the smile that didn't reach far enough, and skipped the hello. Who do I need to talk to? Nobody. I'm fine. You keep saying that word like it means something, she almost told him. Standing there in the noise of the airport, away from the house and its listening walls, she almost handed him everything, the drawer, the ledger, the name that kept surfacing where it shouldn't. She stopped herself at the same threshold for the second time that week. Here, she said. Not yet. He didn't push. He also didn't leave, which was its own kind of answer, and for the first time in 2 weeks, Simone had someone in that house who was fully, unambiguously on her side. He earned his keep faster than she expected. 2 nights in, he caught one of the household staff photographing the guest wing hallway on a phone that wasn't hers, a small thing, easy to explain away, except the staff member's explanation changed twice in under a minute. Desmond didn't make a scene. He simply mentioned it to Simone afterward, quietly, the way you hand someone a loaded fact instead of a loaded accusation. Watching you specifically, he said. Not the house, you. Watching for what? That, he said, is the part I'd like an answer to before your husband gets home. That night, going through the study one more time to confirm what she already suspected, Simone found a second name in the ledger, one that made her stomach drop in a way the first hadn't. A name connected to the exact syndicate Junho had flown across the ocean to negotiate against. Her hands weren't steady when she photographed that page. She sat on the floor of the study afterward, back against the cold wood of the desk, and let herself feel, for exactly 30 seconds, the full weight of what she now understood, that the danger in this house had never been the insults at dinner. It had been sitting in a drawer the entire time, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. Then she stood, straightened her dress, and went back to her room the way she'd trained herself to move through this house for 3 weeks, like nothing had touched her at all. Right before we go any further, if this is your first time watching, welcome, we're glad you found this one. And if you've been with us since part 1, welcome back, thank you for coming back for more. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We read every single one. And if you're already holding your breath for Simone right now, make sure you're subscribed, because what she just found is about to bring everything to a head. Junho's negotiation, on the other side of the world, was falling apart in a way that had nothing to do with the numbers on the table. He'd noticed it 2 days in, a name mentioned once, almost casually, by a man across from him who had no reason to know it. His mother's name. Dropped into a sentence about internal cooperation, like it belonged there, like it was already common knowledge among people it had no business reaching. He hadn't reacted. 11 years of doing business with dangerous men had taught him that the moment you let your face answer a question, you'd already lost the negotiation. But something in his chest had gone cold and stayed there, and that night, alone in a hotel room 3 time zones from home, he'd found himself staring at his phone, at the message thread with Simone, at some things shouldn't sitting there unanswered by anything but silence. He told himself the unease was about the deal. He told himself that for 2 more days, until the deal collapsed entirely, the other side walking away from the table with a confidence that made no sense unless they already believed they had another way in. That was when he'd made the call that ended his trip 3 days early. Not to Simone. To the pilot. He hadn't told her he was coming. He'd told himself it was strategy, that if something inside his own house was compromised, the element of surprise mattered more than the courtesy of a warning. The truth, quieter and harder to admit, was that some part of him had simply needed to see her face and know, immediately, without asking, whether she was safe. He hadn't expected to walk through the door and find the answer already in progress. She didn't get the chance to decide what to do with what she'd found. 2 nights later, at a dinner Sujin hadn't told her about, in front of guests she hadn't been given the courtesy of meeting beforehand, Hirin leaned toward Jai-woo and said, just loud enough to carry, that some marriages were simply a phase families outgrow. Jaiwoo laughed. Something in Sujin, emboldened by 2 weeks of getting away with worse, and by a private terror that her son's early flight home meant her own choices were catching up to her, finally let her hand do what her words had been building toward for a month. That was the moment Junho walked through the door 3 days early. Now, in the sitting room with the doors shut and the rest of the house holding its breath somewhere down the hall, he crossed the space between them before she could speak, his hand rising toward her face, not to strike, the way his mother's had. To touch. To confirm, with something closer to disbelief than anger, that she was actually standing there and not another shape of the guilt he'd been carrying since his plane landed early. His fingers stopped an inch from her cheek. Close enough that she felt the warmth of his hand without the contact. Neither of them moved for a beat too long to be nothing. Long, he said, not a question, a demand dressed as one. Long enough. Simone, I'm not doing this the way you want me to do it. Her voice didn't shake, even though everything underneath it did. I'm not going to list every single thing your mother said to me so you can feel worse about being gone. That's not why I stayed quiet. Then why? She hesitated, the first time in 3 weeks she'd hesitated in front of anyone in this house. And doing it in front of only him loosened something in her chest that had been wound tight since the night she found that drawer. Because I found something, she said. And I didn't know yet if telling you would get you killed. He went still. The particular stillness she'd learned over 2 years of marriage meant he was recalculating everything he thought he understood in under 2 seconds. Show me. She did. The photographs, the mismatched figures, the second name, the one tied to the syndicate he'd just spent 3 weeks negotiating against. The one that had walked away from the table like it already owned half the room. He read it without a word. She watched something behind his eyes move from disbelief to fury to something colder and more controlled than either. The specific stillness of a man deciding exactly how much of himself he was willing to burn down to protect what remained of his family and what remained of her. You should have called me, he said finally. Quiet, not accusing, closer to devastated. And said what that your mother might be trading with the people trying to kill you, over a line I didn't know was safe. She shook her head. I wasn't protecting myself by staying quiet. I was protecting you. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that the ledger, the house, even his mother waiting down the hall for a verdict seemed to fall away from the edges of the room. You shouldn't have carried that alone, he said. Any of it. I wasn't planning on staying alone with it much longer. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, not with everything else sitting between them, but close. His hand, still hovering near her cheek, finally closed the distance, resting there the way it should have 3 weeks ago. I came back early because something felt wrong, he said. I didn't know it would be this wrong. You came back at exactly the right time. 10 more seconds and your mother would have found out the hard way that I don't just stand still when people swing at me. That pulled something close to a laugh out of him, dark and gone as fast as it arrived. His thumb moved once against her cheekbone, small enough that no one watching would call it anything at all, large enough that Simone felt it land somewhere much deeper than her skin. Rin's been here, she said, quieter now. More than once. Something flickered across his face, not surprise exactly, more like distaste for a memory he'd hoped had stayed buried. My mother's idea, not mine. I didn't think it was yours, Simone. He waited until she looked at him fully. There's no version of my life where that woman is a question I'm still answering. I wasn't asking a question. You were, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, just too proud to say it out loud. She didn't argue because he wasn't wrong, and there was something almost unbearably intimate about being known that precisely by someone who'd been 3 time zones away for 3 weeks straight. Neither of them closed the last few inches between them. Not yet. There was too much unresolved in the house around them. His mother's betrayal, a folder of photographs, the sound of Jaiwoo's footsteps pausing just outside the door, close enough to be listening. He heard it too. His hand dropped. The moment folded itself back into something safer, the way it always did between them, desire deferred, not denied. This isn't finished, he said, low enough to mean the two of them or his mother or both. I know. He turned toward the door, toward the conversation that was about to reshape the entire family, and stopped once more, glancing back like he needed to confirm one more time that she was really there. Simone. Yeah, thank you for not telling me on that call. I know how close it was. I know you do. A beat. That's exactly why I married you. What followed was not the confrontation Simone expected. She'd imagined shouting. She'd imagined Sujin denying everything, Jaiwoo defending their mother out of habit, some explosive collapse that would end the night in a way loud enough to match everything that had built toward it. Instead, Junho walked into his mother's study, closed the door, and spoke to her for 11 minutes in a voice so level Simone, waiting just outside, close enough to hear the shape of it without the words, almost preferred the shouting she'd braced for. Whatever passed between them in that room. It left Sujin's face when she finally emerged, older than Simone had ever seen it, not defeated, something more complicated than that. A woman confronting, for the first time in 30 years, the exact size of what she'd traded away. She stopped in front of Simone in the hallway. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I was protecting this family the only way I knew how," Sujin said finally. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't quite a justification either. It sat somewhere uncomfortable in between. "You were protecting yourself," Simone said. "Not cruel, just accurate. There's a difference, and I think you know it." Something crossed Sujin's face that might have been the beginning of shame, or might only have been exhaustion wearing its shape. She didn't answer. She walked past Simone down the hall, and for the first time in 3 weeks, it was Simone who stayed standing while someone else retreated. Di-hyun found Junho alone on the terrace an hour later, staring out at nothing in particular. "You knew," Junho said, "not a question. I suspected." Di-hyun didn't defend himself. "I should have called you the moment I did. Didn't you? Because I wasn't sure yet whether I was protecting the family," Di-hyun said, "or protecting the version of it that no longer exists." He let that sit a moment. "I won't make that mistake again." Junho studied him for a long time, long enough that Di-hyun understood exactly how close he'd come, in that moment, to losing something 11 years couldn't fully guarantee back. "Don't," Junho said finally. Just that. And in the specific economy of the Kang family, both men understood it was as close to forgiveness as the moment could hold. Simone found Junho on the terrace not long after, the night gone quiet around them in the particular way it does after a storm has passed through and left everyone too tired to speak of it further. "Much did you hear?" he asked, without turning. "Enough." He held out a hand, not a demand this time, not a question either. An offer. She crossed the space and let him fold his fingers around hers, and for a while neither of them said anything, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him in the cold night air. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if I'd been 3 days later," he said eventually. "I would have handled it." "I know you would have." His thumb moved once over her knuckles. "That's not what scares me." She turned to look at him fully. "What does?" "That you would have had to." She didn't have an answer for that. Not one that wouldn't have cracked something open in her that she'd spent 3 weeks keeping carefully shut. So instead she stepped closer, close enough that the space between them stopped being a question and started being a choice. And for the first time since he'd walked through that door, neither of them pulled back. His hand came up to her face again, the same motion from the sitting room, except this time nothing interrupted it. His fingers found her jaw, tilted her face up toward his, and he paused there, close enough that she could feel his breath, close enough that the entire 3 weeks of silence and small cruelties and unanswered fear seemed to collapse down into the half-inch of space still left between them. "Simone, don't ask," she said. He didn't let her finish the sentence. He closed the distance himself, and whatever words either of them had been circling for 3 weeks dissolved into something neither of them needed to say out loud anymore. It didn't last long. It wasn't supposed to, not with everything still unresolved in the house behind them, not with his mother's betrayal still sitting unaddressed, and a rival syndicate somewhere out there recalculating its next move. But it was enough. It was the first moment in 3 weeks that felt like the floor under her had stopped moving. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested against hers, both of them breathing like they'd been holding something in for far longer than the last few minutes. "I should have come home sooner," he said quietly. "You came home exactly when it mattered." He almost smiled at that, almost, the ghost of it there and gone. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket, and whatever softness had settled over his face sharpened instantly back into the version of him the world usually saw. He read the message. His jaw tightened. "What is it?" Simone asked. "Someone from the negotiation," he said slowly. "Just confirmed the rival syndicate knew about my mother's arrangement before I did." He looked up at her. "Which means whoever's been watching this house isn't finished. They were never planning to stop at the ledger." Simone's phone buzzed at nearly the same moment. still resting on the small table behind them where she'd left it. She didn't need to look to know it wasn't him this time. The unknown number again. 4 new words, colder than either message before it. She's not the only one watching. Junho read it over her shoulder, and whatever peace had settled into the last few minutes evaporated instantly, replaced by something focused and lethal in its stillness. Simone. His voice had changed completely, low, controlled, the voice she imagined he used in rooms she'd never been allowed to see. Whoever sent that has been in this house, or has someone in it. She looked up at him, steady despite the cold spreading through her chest. Then we find out who, together this time. No more waiting until I have proof solid enough to matter. Something in his expression, pride, fear, love, all tangled into one thing he didn't have time to separate, settled into a decision. Together, he agreed. Neither of them moved from the terrace for a long moment, the two of them standing in the quiet with a threat neither could yet name. The taste of the first kiss they'd waited 3 weeks and a small war for still lingering between them. And somewhere in the dark beyond the gate, someone who already knew far more about this family than they should have watched, and waited, and began making a call of their own. And that's where we have to leave things tonight. If you're new here, welcome. We're glad you found this story. And if you've been watching since the beginning, thank you for coming back. It means more than you'd think. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We read every single one. If this story already has you holding your breath, make sure you're subscribed, because part 2 picks up the second that message finishes sinking in, and it's about to prove Sujin's betrayal was never the whole story. What would you have done in Simone's place? Let us know below.